Tom Seng. He is the Director of School of Energy Economics, Policy, and Commerce at the University of Tulsa. In addition to his instructional duties as Mervin, the Professor of Energy Business, Tom serves as Director of the School of Energy Economics, Policy, and Commerce with primary responsibilities for coordinating undergraduate and graduate programs. He has more than 30 years of experience in the oil and gas industry, primarily in the midstream sector, and 14 years of experience as an adjunct instructor for various universities. His primary expertise lies in the areas of energy markets and commodities trading, but he is well versed in industry aspects of supply chain and logistics, particularly as they apply to the midstream oil and gas sector and the power sector. Prior to joining the University of Tulsa, Mr. Seng served as Manager of Product Marketing for Superior Pipeline, Senior Director of Market Development at Atlas Pipeline Midcontinent, Senior Director for Commercial Operations at Ozark Gas Transmission Company, West Region Director, and Director of Risk Services at ONEOK Energy Services, and Midcontinent Manager at PanEnergy Trading. So a lot of different roles there, but please join me in welcoming Tom.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I came in from Tulsa, GPA headquarters, about 2 miles from my house. I had dinner with Joel Moxley, the president, just a month or so ago. So yeah, my background is midstream, and the program, actually, we have our undergraduate program in energy management, has actually been endorsed by GPA because of its content. What I want to talk about today, just to kind of give us a fresher on where we see things currently. Where do we stand today as an oil and gas industry? Some forecasts in terms of the growth of the industry. What does that look like moving forward? And then just some things about adopting to transition in general. It seems as though everybody wants to do everything or feels compelled to do everything that's out there. This is one of my favorite slides to show. Whenever I do a presentation, I try to get, I'm going to put this in here if I can, and I don't have to hold on to it. Great. I try to give, whoops, did I turn it off by doing that? That I did, there we go. We're back, thank you. I try to give folks really a clear picture of what's going on with energy in the United States. In other words, there's a perception, right, that we've continually moved slowly, surely, but successfully away from fossil fuels, and that's not really the case. Where I live, out in Oklahoma, if you drive across Kansas, if you drive across Oklahoma, you drive across Texas, you see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of wind turbines, and they're huge, and so they're impressive, right? And so unfortunately, I think that gives people the idea that we are generating considerable amount of alternative energy. Well, the fact is last year, only 3% of electricity in the United States came from wind. But it's that they're so obvious and they're so huge that there's an impression that folks have. So this shows essentially the mix. This is the energy mix that we used as a country in 2014. And you can see again, largely natural gas, petroleum, coal starts to shrink, but what call your attention to that small green piece. And again, it's a small green piece of the pie. So as of 2014, 10% of all the energy that came from various renewables. So that's hydro, wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, so only 10%. We move forward, okay, a full 6 years, and it's only grown to 12%. Now, there's some aggressive predictions out there that when the numbers come in fact, the new report should be out by the end of this month, that 2021 will show that it's about 18% of energy consumed in the United States. I don't know that we're going to see that big of an increase, but we'll find out soon enough. But you'll also notice, too, natural gas gained considerably over coal. And obviously that has to do with the switch to natural gas for generating purposes. Number one, up until this last 6 months or so, it's been less expensive to burn natural gas at some power plants than to coal. Also, obviously, cleanest burning fuel that we have for power generation. So again, coal will continue to decline. Natural gas is going to be the benefactor of that. Looking currently at, you can see in terms of electric generating capacity, natural gas, again, has just taken off. So coal will decline. There will be continued coal plants that are going to be shuttered and mothballed. Nuclear, fairly stable. But we're going to see hydro, and we're going to see wind, and we're going to see solar increase. There are some new hydroelectric projects that are being installed on existing dams throughout the United States. So I want to talk about what we consider dislodging events. If you go back, let's go back 3 years ago, there were some very aggressive goals in terms of things like carbon capture, various ESG initiatives. But then it's sort of as if Mother Nature kind of smacked the human race in the face across the globe and said, time out. The time frame that you think you're going to move away from fossil fuels is not going to happen. So we looked at, I started back last February essentially to come forward, and you look at the mess that happened in Texas. Absolutely catastrophic mess. The only energy source down there that didn't fail was nuclear. Finger pointing left and right, all kinds of political gesturing. ERCOT has tried to do some things. They got through this past winter, fortunately, smoothly, but they didn't have a winter storm like Uri. And then in Oklahoma, some ridiculously high natural gas prices. Again, a lot of that was gouging. It was not market-based. It was those who had it were going to charge an arm and a leg for the utilities and things. And then last summer was interesting, because you go back to last summer and all of a sudden there was a heat wave in the UK, there was a heat wave in Europe. And one of the ironies that the UK found out was, guess what, the wind doesn't blow all the time. So they were assuming a certain level of electricity would come from the offshore wind turbines in the North Sea, and that didn't happen. So they had to turn to natural gas. Continental Europe had to turn to natural gas. In fact, it was bad enough in the UK they were actually burning gas oil at some of their power plants. And gas oil for us is similar to heating oil. And then of course over in Europe, so we had the increased use of natural gas in terms of LNG imports. And then of course France, you go back just 2 years ago and Macron, the president who was just reelected, he was anti-nuclear, not going to build nuclear power plants, going to look to phase them out, and all of a sudden, after last summer, he's reversed his position, and now they're going to plan out about 12 nuclear power plants. Now, Germany is walking away from nuclear power. Again, these types of moves, Germany's going to have to rely considerably on natural gas. And we know the situation currently that we'll talk about in a minute. China also had record heat last summer, low gas supply. What did they do? Well, they essentially increased their LNG exports to the extent that they could, but they ramped up coal. So again, this is a country second only probably to India in terms of horrible pollution because they generate electricity using coal. And then we had the debacle in California and the Northwest. One of the, I don't want to criticize California too much, but they're kind of like a lab where the rest of us get to see people make mistakes. So, they've for decades have said, they're going to legislate things. We're going to do this. You're going to, no plan, no advice on how to. It's just, well, don't confuse us with the facts. Here's what we need to do. So what was interesting last year was they came out of the winter of 2021, and they are heavily reliant on snowpack throughout the Sierra Nevadas, and it was below normal. So in the spring, the water that normally runs off did not fill the reservoirs, did not fill the rivers that they rely on for hydroelectric supply. So they were stuck last summer, again, the combination of low hydro availability, record heat. What did they end up having to do? They had to use natural gas more to generate power, and they had to import power from other states and admit that, oh yes, that power that we're importing is coming from fossil fuels in other states. Again, largely, natural gas. They're basically mothballing the second nuclear power plant in the states, so they'll have no nuclear come next year. And then one of the things that is interesting too, they tend to stub their toe a lot. When they implemented credits for residential solar photovoltaic panels, they did not require those homeowners to pay the local utility a monthly fee, a monthly connection fee. And now there's a big pushback because the utilities are saying, well, the rest of the ratepayers are having to pay for this. They're essentially subsidizing solar power for the residents who have that. So now they want to tax the solar panels and they want to charge them a connection fee. So they should have done it right to begin with. So what's interesting is a state that you would think would encourage their residents to put solar panels on the roofs is now basically putting a stumbling block in place to have that. And the final point here, though, for California anyhow, is this is their goal. Okay? They do not want to be using natural gas peaking power plants. They want to rely on battery storage. And it's interesting, You have several companies that are doing large-scale utility battery storage. But what I think is interesting in California is I think they sort of finagled things in that if you can provide power into the grid for 4 hours, just 4 hours during peak, okay, that's a peaking resource. And there are incentives and there are peak power prices that you receive for doing that. Well, what I think is interesting is most of the battery storage in California that's being built, utility scale, can only provide power for about 4 hours. You can't do that in Oklahoma or Texas or Louisiana, anywhere out near where I live. It gets hot as hell in the summertime, and our peaks are really 10 a.m. to probably 11 p.m. in terms of the temperatures and the heat. So I kind of think this was interesting that they played this game where it's almost as if they went to the battery storage manufacturers and said, well, how long can you provide power into the grid? They said 4 hours. They said, fine, great, we're going to make it 4 hours is peaking. And then, of course, unfortunately, this tragedy that continues to unfold every day. And really, the spike that we've seen in oil prices and natural gas prices has been actually more related. In other words, if you go back to February of last year, and things started to open up again, demand started to pick up. The oil and gas industry had been essentially almost gutted by the demand destruction that occurred from March 20 forward. And so the demand picked up, obviously production lagged. So we had some prices. I think when we got to $90 a barrel, that was realistically supply, demand supported type price for oil. Last summer even, we had seen over $6 for natural gas. We're now seeing $7. We hit $8 last week at one point in time. But I think, we're now this above $100 level, I think really has to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's a fear factor, and the fear has been, will countries actually boycott the oil and natural gas coming out of Russia? If they do, then we are in a very tight supply-demand marketplace globally, and if you pull those barrels off or the MCF off the marketplace, sure, it's going to make things even tighter. And so the prices we're seeing a lot are supported by, unfortunately, this situation. Germany, I don't know if you saw, finally said they're willing to agree with the rest of the EU countries that they will start, and again, it's probably a phase out, but they will start to ban importation of oil. And Germany, West Germany, really, they're probably more dependent on oil and natural gas from Russia than any other country. One of the other interesting things that's happened too with this is, this was something I did not know until I finally researched about it. Russia and Ukraine produce a considerable amount of fertilizer. And of course, the irony there is, natural gas is 80% of the feedstock to create fertilizer. So you have this potential of an interruption of Russian and Ukraine fertilizer into the global markets, not only as well as the feedstock to make fertilizer. So kind of getting back to this thing where we're headed with energy transition, a large source of renewable natural gas in the United States is manure from farms. And the farmers tend to, they sell that. They sell it to a company that has a biodigester. They create the renewable natural gas. They put it back into the grid system. Well, the problem now is fertilizer is so expensive. These farmers don't want to sell the manure. They're going to use it themselves. So again, this snowball that across the value chain for energy around the globe, things are continuing to sort of escalate. So here's where we are currently. In terms of the U.S., we hit 11.9 million barrels. Last week, it was about the same. The week before that, if you recall, going back to around March 1st of 2020, we were at 13 million barrels a day. Okay? Not only a record for the United States, but world's leader at that point in time in terms of oil production. So a year ago, about 11, and then as I mentioned, we were 11.9 last week. What's interesting is, we produce that, and so people toss around the term, energy independence. That is never going to happen. We are absolutely, positively never going to be energy independent, and I say that because we are in a global market. As long as we're exporting any kind of energy, we're going to be impacted by global prices. We can get to a point of energy self-sufficiency, but we're still a ways from that. So just looking at the numbers, currently the refineries are using almost 16 million a day. Okay, 60 million barrels a day. That's the primary, obviously, demand source for oil in the United States, but we're also exporting another 4. This is a peak. We have a record amount of oil that we're exporting, 4.3 million barrels a day. So there we are at about 20 million barrels a day of consumption, so to speak. We're not even in the summer yet. In the summertime, our U.S. refineries will be using closer to 18 million barrels a day. Okay, so we import about 6 million barrels a day. So the question always is, well, wait a minute, why are we exporting and importing at the same time? Anybody have the answer to that? Do it. What type of oil do we produce mostly in the United States right now? 70% of the oil produced in the United States is shale oil. It's a very light oil. U.S. refineries are not set up to produce nothing but light oil. If you think about it, you run a refinery, you can extract less product out of a lighter oil than a heavy oil. So we end up having to import heavy oils. This is one of the reasons why the Keystone XL pipeline was such a key thing. That's heavy bitumen, thick. They take the tar sands. They use steam to remove the oil from the sand, but then you've got almost a molasses type of oil. We pipe it. It comes in. There is a Keystone pipeline. A lot of the public thinks I loved it a couple weeks ago. It was like, turn on Keystone. Sorry, gang. The Keystone XL hasn't been built yet, but Keystone, the original Keystone pipeline, runs from Alberta to the Midwest and then down to Cushing, Oklahoma, just down from Tulsa, world's largest crude oil storage and pipeline hub. So when the thicker crude comes down there, they literally dedicate some tanks to take the light shale oil, mix it with the heaviers, and now you've got a blend, an API of about 42, which is what our refineries need to produce the most product. So we sort of had this, we're essentially exporting light oil, importing heavy oil, so that the balance at the refineries is what it needs to be. These are commercial stocks. We've drawn this down considerably. You can see we're down to 414 million barrels, again, of commercially available oil versus 493 a year ago. And then the SPR, we've been just throwing that out there like candy almost. 556 million barrels. You can see we were 80 million barrels higher about a year ago. What's important about this is not just, in other words, the current prices also reflect the fact that we're going to have to refill all this. You name it, if it's natural gas, if it's natural gas liquids, if it's refined products, if it's raw crude, our inventory levels are at least at 8-year lows. So if all of a sudden everybody stopped driving tomorrow, there still would be demand for gasoline just to get our inventories back up again. And we're heading into summer, in a couple of months. So again, my point is, these higher prices are going to stay for a while. They definitely are. Somebody could assassinate Putin tomorrow, because I heard that was suggested by somebody. I didn't come up with that. But no, let's just say the Russia-Ukraine situation just flips all of a sudden, and we're at peace. We're still going to see some fairly strong prices, because essentially there's some makeup to be done. We've been drawing our inventories down for a considerable amount of time. Crude oil production, that's just a graph, the blue showing where we are today versus a year ago. Refinery inputs, again, we've been running refineries. I do have a concern here. We've been running refineries at or slightly above 90%. So 90% of the capacity to refine crude oil in the United States has been running constantly. This is the period. We're almost through April. Generally, you see them roll back quite a bit because two things happen. Number one, they do maintenance ahead of the summer driving period. The other thing is they have to switch the blends. There are different additives. We all buy 90-10 at the pump. That 10% switches from winter to summer, again, depending on the part of the country. So they're usually going through that right now, and we're not seeing a decline in this. My concern is we're going to be running the refineries too high, and then we may have some unforced outages come this summertime. And then exports, as I mentioned, we hit a new high. Countries that we export to, again, China, Canada, Netherlands, India, and South Korea. India is about where China was 10 years ago. They are using a ton of coal. They're importing a ton of liquefied natural gas, a ton of petroleum products, both raw crude and refined products. So we kind of, everybody focuses on China, but India is sneaking up from a sort of a manufacturing process. Their industrial demand for energy is going to continue upwards. And then imports, in an ideal world, this would come down, but we're still fairly reliant on them, because I said, because of the grades. And then imports, here you go. This is probably the good thing. We're talking about, the situation with Russia and oil, and the Biden administration saying they were going to ban imports. We were getting negligible amount of actual crude oil from Russia. We did get some imported refined products, but the total amount was only about 400,000 barrels a day. The expectation was that other people would say, yeah, that's a good idea, and we're going to do it too. The great thing about Canada, though, usually 60% of what we get comes from there. Again, that's why I was still a proponent of Keystone XL. It's a friendly nation. They're right at our border. It's being moved by pipeline, and it is a grade of oil that we have to blend with our own lighter shale. The other cool thing is, they're a peaceful nation. If they stopped sending oil, we just invade them. We just walk up, say, hey, we're here now. We need that oil back. But all kidding aside, very little from Saudi Arabia. I mean, so these issues come up about conflicts in the Middle East or the situation with Russia, Ukraine. We are very fortunate that the majority, you can see this, the majority of the oil we import comes from two of our neighbors. So this illustrates what I was talking about before. So this is the status of the commercial inventories presently. The gray area is kind of the high and low on a 5-year average, and then the blue line is where we are today. So you can see we're well below where we should be, especially we're 6 weeks from summer, 6 weeks at most from summer driving season. And this is the commercially available stocks. And then of course we've been pulling down the SPR. There's more to come out of that because more has been pledged. That was another interesting thing. The media, as we all know, doesn't know generally what they're talking about. But when Biden said, "Oh, we're going to release 80 million barrels," honest to God, this one correspondent was on the news saying 80 million barrels per day, and I just went, "Oh my Lord, who told her that? And why would you say that?" The issue became it sounded like a lot. The market kind of reacted to it, but the fact is, we might be able to deliver 1 million barrels a day out of the SPR. And when you're talking about 20 million a day of consumption, that was not really a big impact, and so we really didn't see much of a drop in the marketplace. On the natural gas supply, we continue to increase natural gas. You guys are sitting on top of the largest natural gas producing area in the country, between the Marcellus and the Utica. So we're at about 94 BCF a day of actual dry production. And again, this is natural gas coming from the shale plays. Okay, and again, you all are sitting at the top there. And the growth prospects, obviously, we could not have foreseen, there were dark days, right, in 2020 into 2021. No one could have predicted what would have happened, but we did. We got back to increased demand. Companies been holding the line on production, not chasing the higher prices. The investors have said, we want to see free cash flow. We'd like you to buy some shares back, pay us dividends. And if you look at earnings reports, that does tell the story of where we are today. Pick up any earnings reports, and you'll see they're going to emphasize free cash flow. And they tell shareholders, hey, we're going to pay this dividend. I think with Devon Energy in Oklahoma City, they had acquired WPX this past year. I think they had a record of $1 a share. And if you go to their website, they talk about their cash return program. Almost as if they're selling cars and there's some kind of rebate. It's kind of interesting the way it's phrased, but that's where we are right now. So there's been a disciplined environment that we didn't have 10 years ago. $100 oil 10 years ago, we'd have been after that. So it's been good. It's been a very strong supply-demand scenario that we're seeing. From a demand perspective, in terms of looking here, industrial demand is fairly steady. It's power and residential that goes up and down. But I want to call your attention to two things. The Mexico imports. Now, we have been exporting to Mexico for a considerable period of time. Back when I was in the industry, I actually sold natural gas to Pemex at the city of El Paso, Texas, and then they took it in. But what happened about 5 years ago, their electric industry was opened up. So you had private companies coming in, building mostly natural gas-fired power plants. Gas cycle, combined cycle, natural gas power plants. And so the imports have increased, exports have increased. We're up to 6 BCF a day. That we don't know what's going to happen because, they elected another nut job down there, and now he's thinking, ooh, we should nationalize these companies, these power plants that these private companies had just built in the last decade. Now, the other key thing, though, is LNG pipeline receipts. This reflects the amount of gas being delivered to the LNG export facilities across the country, and we've got at least 6 right now that are active. So we've actually peaked. Last month, we peaked at about 13 BCF a day of equivalent deliveries to the LNG export facilities. This is market that did not exist 10 years ago. Absolutely didn't. And it started here. Trust me, I was researching some things back then when I was working for Superior and in Tulsa, and it was producers up in this area who were looking for outlets and started talking to the Cheniers of the world about, hey, what do you think? You know, we're seeing a situation we might have excess domestic natural gas. And so there's gas being shipped from this area down to the Gulf Coast to these LNG export facilities. So again, huge market that didn't exist just 10 years ago. And this is kind of what the exports have looked like. The part of the probably always right is we can be our own worst enemy. At $7, you've got industrials in this country who aren't happy about that and start to press, you know, their respective legislators. Hey, you should. Why are we exporting natural gas when it's so expensive for our residents? It's expensive to use in industrial facilities. That's just always going to be the case. Nobody said when prices were ridiculously cheap, hey, we should throw them some extra money now to keep this supply going. And then just kind of, this is an interesting crossover because the brown is pipeline deliveries, okay, or natural gas exports via pipeline, whereas the blue is by tanker, the LNG. And so we've ramped it up. As I mentioned, we hit a record. This will continue to happen. I was talking to a news source last evening, and they were like, you know, well, Biden said he wants to help Europe with additional natural gas deliveries. He said, well, what do you think? I said, well, they can't right now. We're maxed out. Until there's new trains added, we are maxed out. These are the countries. It's kind of squabbly here, but you can kind of see it's Pacific Rim countries, it's some of continental Europe, and it's even South America that we're sending liquefied natural gas to. And again, major LNG markets, China, again, number one, Japan, South Korea, India, and Taiwan. So as I said, people don't focus enough on India. They're going to be the second largest consumers of fossil fuels behind China within very short order. And we did, because of what we've done, right now we are the world's largest exporter of LNG. It used to be Qatar and Australia, and then US creeping up, and we've shot past both of them. So kind of looking forward, this is what's interesting about some of these ESG targets and things. You know, on the one hand, there's everyone saying, oh, by 2050, the world's going to change and we're going to have a dramatically reduced use of fossil fuels. And yet, this is the federal government. This is the Energy Information Administration. They're part of the Department of Energy. And they just gather statistics. It's not a Republican thing. It's not a Democratic thing. They're just an information provider. And yet they're predicting, what appears to be some fairly stable, if not increased use of petroleum and natural gas. So you can see petroleum and natural gas remain the most consumed sources of energy in the United States through 2050. So that tells you that this whole other renewable side isn't going to grow as fast as those who support those projects will tell you they're going to happen. Wind and solar incentives, and again, right, the key word there, incentives. So with continuation of incentives for wind and solar, along with the falling costs, support robust competition with natural gas for electric generation. While shares of coal and nuclear decrease. U.S. oil production reaches record highs while natural gas production is increasingly driven by natural gas exports. They're not saying exactly what they believe the record high will be. As I said, we've been at 13 million barrels a day. This chart shows that maybe we're at 14, possibly 14.5 million barrels a day by 2050. But again, I find it ironic that their data suggests, guess what? Pretty steady, if not increased, use in oil and natural gas, and that's not what we hear on the streets, so to speak. Refining capacity, we haven't added new refining capacity in quite some time. So that's going to be fairly stable. And then your exports of liquids and imports of crude. Again, imports probably fairly stable because we're going to be increasing our own production. And then natural gas demand, more than likely, one of the biggest drivers is going to be electric generation. You talk about just, if we all think about how much our own consumption of electricity changed in the last decade, right? I mean, I've got a laptop, I've got a phone, I've got a watch I have to charge, there's tablets, there's all these things that everyone has that they didn't have a decade ago. Just east of Tulsa, there's a large Google data center. And that thing sucks electricity, like nobody's business. So again, there's going to be more power usage. They're going to have an increase in generation of power using natural gas. The other thing, again, for those of you already familiar with that, we know that renewable energy is intermittent, right? The sun does not always shine and the wind does not always blow. And so those two sources, without battery storage, they're just too intermittent and you can't run a grid that way. Natural gas is the peaking fuel source. Natural gas-fired power plants, whether they're gas turbines or they're combined cycle gas turbine plants, they can ramp up and ramp down easier than any other source. So again, I think it's a rosier picture than what you tend to think is out there. I think that sort of a public mindset that says we're moving away from this stuff, but in reality, if you ask people tomorrow, say, all right, stop driving the gasoline vehicle, oh, by the way, stop heating your home and those things, then all of a sudden it might dawn on them that things are not exactly where they think. I do find one of the most irony, I read an article again this morning, people protesting a pipeline. The show, oh, we don't want this pipeline. But the reporters don't have the guts to say, how did you get here? Bicycle? Did you drive your EV that you charged at home with solar panels? I mean, I'm speaking to the choir. I know that it's hypocritical. So again, just natural gas supply, again, depending on the price levels, looking to increase. Renewables will definitely increase. And again, unless some of these incentives go away. CO2 emissions, as the speaker before, John mentioned, this is something that if the industry can do more and more of this, it's going to change that image. One of the companies I would encourage you to go out and look at Lucid Energy, LUCID. They're the largest gatherer processor in the Delaware Basin. Their CEO, Mike Lacham, gave a presentation a few weeks back that I was fortunate enough to watch. They are on it. They are working diligently on Scope 1 and Scope 2. And they're using the 45Q tax credits, and they're actually finding a way to actually make that revenue positive. And so I'm asking him, see if he can come speak at the annual GPA in September, because I believe, just like John's presentation, the industry needs to understand it can be done. Because it seems like a lot of folks are like, we don't want to do it. Well, maybe we'll get a change in administration, we won't have to do it. It's coming, there's no avoiding it. And I love to see that, Lucid, John's company, E3's got the technologies, Lucid's doing it. That's the way to truly clean up the industry. And then adapting, these are just some of my summary thoughts here. So everybody talks about hydrogen. Believe it or not, there's different colors of hydrogen. What's interesting is, in the last year, you have several companies go, we're going to do hydrogen. But if you nailed them down, so what do you mean you're going to do hydrogen? Exactly, what's going to happen here? So blue hydrogen is the hydrogen extracted from CH4 methane molecules using electrolysis. Well, what's the source of the electricity? Green is, so for instance, let's just say if you were able to, let's say you had methane, you used wind or solar as the electricity for the electrolysis process, you extracted the hydrogen, you're still kind of looking at, potentially being green, but the fact is what were the emissions in terms of the drilling, exploration, production of the natural gas itself. So true green is coming from a renewable source. This is actually technology that is being utilized. Offshore rigs in the North Sea, there are several of them. They actually extract seawater. They use the electrolysis process to separate out the hydrogen. They use the hydrogen and run power turbines for the entire platform. So it's possible. This next one is one of these ones where it just cracks me up and you just want to bang your head against the wall. Because I was looking at this and go, what do you mean turquoise hydrogen? Well, you take natural gas, create ammonia, and then you flip it around and you extract the hydrogen out of it. It absolutely makes no sense to me, but it's out there. And then, of course, operational issues, right? I mean, you all work for midstream companies. You can't just take a pipeline that's shipping 98% methane and say, we're going to start just pushing hydrogen down it, and we hope the power plants and the hot water heaters don't blow up. I mean, it's a combustible fuel. It's completely different. I mean, just think about your outdoor barbecue grills. I've got a natural gas stub at my house. When we built the house, I put it in there because I use natural gas for grilling, but there's folks that use propane and butane. You can't just go, here, have some hydrogen. So there's going to be, all the burner tip changes are going to have to happen as well. And someone needs to have a pilot program. I would love to see one of the utilities in Oklahoma get a small town that's willing to experiment with this. Let's see if hydrogen will work in a distribution system or not. Let's see here. And then of course, So you've got the molecular level, CH4 versus H2, okay? So we're already talking about methane leakage throughout the system in terms of operations. Higher propensity for H2 to leak in microscopic ways. We're already working on renewable natural gas. We have commercialized large-scale biodigesters in the country. It's just a question of being able to expand those. Renewable fuels already being commercialized, mostly biomass delivered. There are some that, if you take regular diesel and you add some ethanol to it, they're considering that renewable fuels. And the geothermal expansion, this is a big area because we've not really focused on this. You do have areas mostly in the western part of the United States where they're actually using the steam. I mean, if you think Yellowstone and Old Faithful, using that naturally occurring geothermal steam to run a steam turbine to create electricity. So now we're investigating that more. One of the things I think is unique is the geothermal industry never really spoke to the oil and gas, the E&P industry, and now there are those who have enlightened them to the idea of horizontally going into a thermal zone. They were using vertical. So now they're extracting more of this naturally occurring heat. We're definitely going to see increased use of solar, but as I mentioned, it's going to have to be relying on battery. And then there are land use issues with some of these things. Both commercial and residential PVs and the utility scale farms, there's a form of concentrated solar. That's where you're literally taking the heat from the sun and you're able to create steam for industrial purposes or for power generation. There are also ways now folks are looking at what we're calling molten salt storage. You find a subterranean salt formation, you use the concentrated solar to heat it up, and it stores that heat until you need to pull it back up out of that formation. Increased use of wind power, again, dependent on battery storage. There are land use issues. Yep, the bird death situation has not been resolved. And then, of course, there's a big issue with the recycling of the blades themselves. Carbon capture, John did a great job. He talked about this. This is something, as I mentioned, that the industry needs to have. If they can do this, that's cleaning up things. But I kind of find this atmospheric one as pretty much a folly. I mean, Exxon, you can see so many times when you read these announcements that come out, they're driven by shareholders. So Exxon felt compelled. Oh, yeah, we're going to do a multi-billion-dollar project in the U.S. Gulf Coast to capture atmospheric carbon. Can you imagine the energy required to have these massive, they're going to end up being like vacuums to suck this stuff out of the, so anyhow, it starts in the field. If we can do the field operations, as John was explaining, that you start to basically minimize that. And then pipeline conversions, this was kind of interesting because those of you may or may not be familiar with the Navigator pipeline's been proposed. They're going to gather CO2 from multiple ethanol facilities in the Midwest, convert it to liquid CO2, and then ship it. I was kind of struck by the fact that why are interstate pipeline companies right now who have natural gas and potentially could have some stranded pipeline assets, why are they not looking at this? How come we're looking at a brand new pipeline thing? And then from a land perspective, who owns the pore space now? When we're talking about carbon capture and sequestration, and I will say I'm not familiar with land issues up this way, but in Oklahoma, pore follows surface. If you're the surface owner, you get pore space. In Texas, there are two different court cases that have conflicting opinions about that. And in Oklahoma, we have tribal issues. I think the tribe, they own the minerals. The surface owner, again, according to Oklahoma law, the surface owner owns the right to pore space. So if we want to use a depleted oil gas reservoir, then the surface owner should receive the money for any carbon capture and sequestration that happens there. I guarantee the tribe's not going to like that when they find out that there's some type of revenue source. There will be court challenges over that as well. And then these are kind of just my general thoughts. Too many times I talk to companies, they're, as I said, we're going to do hydrogen, and then when you nail them down, it's like, what do you mean you're going to do that? First of all, do you understand what we're talking about? Number two, can you do it? But again, I think they feel like they've got to get these press releases out there so the shareholders are like, oh, okay, you're doing the right thing. So what I tell them, look, just take a deep breath, step back. And this is something we teach, right, in business colleges, a simple SWOT analysis, right? What are your existing strengths? This is an internal evaluation of your company. In this new energy world, in this new dynamic, what are your strengths that can be applied to these changes? What weaknesses? What things should you not be doing? If there's an expensive capital undertaking, maybe for CCS or CCUS, maybe you have to put that off or find another source of capital. But again, opportunities. Where do you fit in the new world? There are so many transferable skills in this industry, and the assets are already in place. So I think that it bodes well for the oil and gas industry. And then the threats. Yeah, you have to make an assessment. Are you going to survive in the new world? As I mentioned, the perception of what's going to happen in terms of reduction in demand for fossil fuels versus what we really see happening are night and day. So this is not, to be honest with you, 3 years ago, well, one of my concerns was, March 1st of 2020, when we kind of went into lockdown, there was the tremendous demand destruction. A year ago at this time, there were companies and various entities who were basically saying, okay, look, we were forced to reduce our carbon footprint because of the COVID lockdowns. We're not going to go back to the level of use that we had in the past. And some companies did that, but the fact is we've seen global things happen now. And I've been saying that for years. If domestically we're going to try to move away from fossil fuels, the world has open arms for U.S. energy. Oil, refined products, natural gas liquids, petroleum feedstocks like ethylene and propylene, and certainly liquefied natural gas. So I don't think it's as bleak as what we sort of thought maybe 3 years ago. Questions? Like I said, I think in general the outlook's very good, especially if we can head down the path that John was talking about, do more carbon capture, do carbon capture sequestration, utilization, those things. The image of the industry will change as we move forward. But from a demand standpoint, it's going to be pretty strong for the next couple of years at least, if for no other reason than we've got to put our storage back up to where they were before. Great, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry.
Are there any commercial scale, grid scale batteries in place anywhere?
Yes, yeah, on both coasts. Duke, if you go out to like Duke Energy here in the Carolinas, PG&E in California, if you look, just even type that in Google, grid scale batteries. Yes, Tesla, obviously a big one. Siemens is another one that's doing these things. Again, they're really kind of almost in a beta phase because they want to see can we rely on those when we most need them. But there's definitely a ton of those projects out there, and like I said, we're going to have to see more of them. You cannot run intermittent wind and solar when the ramp up goes like this and then back down again. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.